My name is Anna Thorne. To my parents, I was never a daughter. I was a tractor that didn't need gasoline. They called me simple and the girl of the soil, while they sent my sister, Clara, to the city's most expensive law school using the money I earned with my blistered hands. They thought that because I had dirt under my fingernails, I didn't have a brain behind my eyes. They left me in the dust of our family farm, believing I was too uneducated to ever escape the horizon of their fields. But dirt is where life begins, and I've spent the last 10 years burying their arrogance deep enough to never see the sun again. The sun in Nebraska doesn't just shine, it punishes. By 5 a.m., the heat was already beginning to crawl over the edges of the porch, a reminder that the day would be long, dry, and unforgiving. I stood there, a heavy bucket of feed in each hand, feeling the familiar ache in my shoulders. I was 19, but my body felt 40. Inside the house, I could hear the clink of silverware and the sound of laughter. My parents, Henry and Martha, were having breakfast with Clara. It was a celebration. Clara was leaving for Lincoln that morning to start her second year of law school. She was the bright one, the hope of the Thorne family, the girl destined for courtrooms and silk robes. I, on the other hand, was the one who stayed. "Anna, stop daydreaming and get to the north coop," my father barked through the screen door. He didn't look at me. He was too busy adjusting Clara's new leather briefcase, a gift that cost more than the new irrigation pump we desperately needed. I didn't answer. I never did. I just walked, the dust kicking up around my heavy work boots. At dinner the night before, the conversation had been a recurring nightmare. I had asked, just once more, if I could take an online course in agricultural business. I wanted to learn about crop rotation, sustainable yields, and land management. I wanted to make the farm more than just a struggle for survival. My mother had laughed, a sharp, thin sound. "Oh, Anna, you're a worker, honey. You have a gift for the earth. But books? Books are for people like Clara. You wouldn't understand the big words they use in the city. Just focus on the corn. That's where you belong." Clara had smirked, swirling her wine. "Don't fill her head with nonsense, Mom. Someone has to keep the lights on here so I can finish my degree. Besides, Anna looks so natural in denim. Can you imagine her in a suit? She'd look like a bear in a dress." They all laughed. Even my father, who knew I was the only reason he hadn't lost the South acreage to debt yet. They saw my silence as stupidity. They saw my obedience as a lack of ambition. What they didn't know was that every night when the house went quiet and the only sound was the wind through the stalks, I was in the tool shed. I had a hidden stash of textbooks I'd got secondhand from a retired professor in town. I had a discarded laptop I'd fixed myself, tethered to a weak satellite signal I paid for with the few dollars I hid from the egg sales. While Clara studied the laws of men, I studied the laws of the earth. I learned about soil pH, about the chemistry of nitrates, and about the burgeoning world of ag tech. I learned that our farm was sitting on a gold mine of potential, wasted by my father's archaic methods. And I learned about the Great Acquisition, a massive development project planned for our county 10 years down the line. The day Clara left was the day I made my vow. I watched the dust from her car settle on my skin. My father walked up to me, wiping his brow. "Listen, Anna, I'm taking out a second mortgage on the back 40. Clara needs a new apartment closer to the university. It's an investment in the family's future. You'll just have to work a bit harder this season to cover the payments." I looked at him, really looked at him. He saw a simple girl. I saw a man who had just handed me the first piece of his downfall. "Okay, Dad," I said softly. "Good girl, you always were the reliable one." He patted my shoulder and headed to the barn. For the next 3 years, I became a ghost. I worked 18 hours a day. I optimized the yields using techniques I'd learned in secret, using natural fertilizers I mixed myself, rotating crops in patterns my father didn't understand. The farm started producing more than it ever had. My father was ecstatic. He thought it was his expertise. He took the extra money and sent it to Clara, who was now living a socialite's life in the city, failing her exams but succeeding in spending our blood and sweat. But I was skimming. Not much, just enough. I was investing in penny stocks of emerging green tech companies I'd researched. I was buying up small, worthless tax lien properties on the edges of the county that the local maps said were useless. By the time I was 22, the tension broke. Clara came home for the summer acting like she was visiting a zoo. She complained about the smell, about the heat, and about my lack of personality. One afternoon, she found my hidden books in the shed. She brought them to the dinner table, throwing them down like they were filth. "You think I can't see you're trying to steal from Dad?" Clara hissed after our parents had gone to bed. She held up a notebook where I'd jotted down notes on future commodity prices. "You are a thief." I looked at her, her face contorted with self-righteous fury. Her accusation, so twisted of reality, it lit a small fuse in the darkness of my pensive mind. "I'm not a thief," I said, my voice low and sharp. "I'm the farmhand, remember? I just work and I don't think. I'm just the girl of the soil." Her eyes narrowed. She didn't like that. "You think you're smart, don't you? You think you would get anywhere without our family." That was when the last seed was planted. She started to yell for Dad. She wanted to tell him about my hidden notebook. I didn't move. I just stared at her. I saw what she was saying. She was afraid of me. She was afraid that I had some sort of secret power, and the only thing she could do was make me feel small. I smiled. "You won't tell him," I said. "You are afraid." She stopped yelling. "I don't care about you at all," she hissed. "You are nothing. You are like dirt." That was the moment. The final seed was planted. I looked at her, my hands clenched at my sides. I didn't feel anger this time. I felt a cold calm settle over me. "You are right," I said. "You are nothing without this dirt." That night, I didn't go to the tool shed. I went to the bus station. I had my documents, my small savings, and my digital portfolio. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say goodbye. I left them with a mortgage they couldn't pay, a farm they didn't know how to run without my labor, and a bright daughter who couldn't tell a weed from a crop. As the bus pulled away, I looked at my hands. They were stained with the soil of Nebraska. I smiled. They thought they had buried me. They didn't realize I was a seed. 10 years, I whispered to the dark window. In 10 years, you'll come to me. I changed my name that night. I became A.L. Thorne, the anonymous founder of TerraFirm Investments. I spent the next decade in the shadows of the corporate world, using the money I'd made from my small land plays to buy up the very soul of the county I said I belonged in. I bought the water rights. I bought the transport hubs. I bought the debt of every struggling farm in the valley. While Clara was struggling to pass the bar exam, and my parents were slowly drowning in the debt they'd accumulated to fund her failures, I was building an empire out of the very dirt they said I belonged in. I was no longer the simple girl. I was the landlord, and the rent was about to be due.
Part 2. The Harvest of Shadows. The first 3 years in the city were a symphony of silence and grind. To the world, I was just another anonymous face working in the back rooms of a logistics firm by day and cleaning office buildings by night. But to myself, I was an architect. I didn't spend a single cent on the luxuries Clara had demanded. No silk dresses, no fancy dinners. Every dollar I earned was funneled into a high-risk, high-reward agricultural futures portfolio I had spent years calculating in that Nebraska tool shed. I remember the day I realized I was no longer a victim. I was sitting in a public library staring at a screen that showed my first major windfall. A small ag tech startup I had invested in had been acquired by a global giant. My modest savings had turned into 6 figures overnight. I didn't celebrate. I didn't buy a drink. I simply opened a map of my home county and circled a plot of land adjacent to my father's farm. Bought, I whispered. I did it through a shell company, Vanguard Soil and Water. My name appeared nowhere. I was a ghost, and I liked it that way. Back in Nebraska, the letters from home, which I received via a P.O. box I checked once a month, were becoming increasingly frantic, though they tried to hide it with condescension. My mother wrote, "Anna, you've been gone for 2 years. We hope you found some menial work that suits your limited skills. The farm is struggling a bit, the weather has been difficult, but Clara is finishing her final year. She'll be a partner at a big firm soon, and then we won't have to worry about the bills you left behind." The bills I left behind. I had to laugh. The farm wasn't struggling because of the weather, it was struggling because my father was still using 1980s methods on 2020 soil, and he no longer had his human tractor to fix his mistakes for free. By the 5th year, my transformation was more than just financial. I had used my gains to pay for a private education under a pseudonym. I sat in lecture halls with the children of billionaires, and while they complained about the difficulty of macroeconomics, I thought about the complexity of nitrogen fixation in a drought. I wasn't just smart, I was dirt smart. I knew how the world actually worked, from the ground up. I watched from afar as Clara finally passed the bar exam on her 4th attempt. My father threw another party he couldn't afford. He sold the last of the quality livestock to pay for the catering. They were eating their future to celebrate a daughter who was nothing but a beautiful, expensive facade. Clara took a job at a mid-tier firm, but her habits didn't change. She wanted the lifestyle of a top-tier litigator without the 60-hour work weeks. She started taking advances from my parents. My father, blinded by his pride in his lawyer daughter, kept signing papers. Step 2, I noted, as my lawyer in the city informed me that Vanguard Soil and Water now held the titles to the 3 largest grain elevators in the region. I was no longer just buying land, I was buying the infrastructure, I was buying the air they breathed and the roads they used to haul their dwindling harvests. One night, 7 years after I left, my father actually called me. I hadn't changed my number, waiting for this moment. "Anna?" His voice was shaky, stripped of the booming authority I remembered. "Hello, Dad. Listen, things are a bit tight here. Clara is handling a very high-profile case, and she needs some temporary capital to maintain her office's image. I was wondering, I know you're probably just working some service job, but do you have any savings? A few $1,000s?" I leaned back in my leather chair in my high-rise apartment, looking at the city lights. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm just a simple girl, remember? I don't really understand how money works. Maybe Clara can use her legal expertise to find a solution." There was a long silence. "You were always selfish, Anna, after all we did for you. Fine, we'll find a way. We always do." He hung up. That was the last time we spoke as father and daughter. From that point on, my moves became aggressive. I knew they were desperate. I waited for the local bank to bundle their delinquent debt. When they did, a company called Terra Firm Investments, my largest shell, was the only bidder. I now owned the mortgage to my childhood home. I owned the land where my books were burned. In year 9, a massive drought hit the Midwest. It was the killing blow for the traditional farmers who hadn't invested in the moisture retention tech I had been secretly installing on my neighboring plots. My father's fields turned to dust. Clara's law firm, failing due to her incompetence and mounting ethics complaints, finally let her go. They were trapped. They were broke, and they were sitting on land that had become worthless to everyone except the person who knew exactly what was buried beneath it. I received a formal request through my legal team. A local family, the Torns, was seeking an audience with the representative of Terra Firm to discuss a debt restructuring and a possible emergency loan. They didn't know who Terra Firm was. They just knew it was the only thing standing between them and the auction block. I told my assistant to schedule the meeting for the 10th anniversary of the day I left. "Tell them to come to the city," I said, "and tell them to bring their lawyer." I spent the night before the meeting in my private greenhouse pruning a small lemon tree. My hands were clean, my nails were manicured, but as I felt the soil between my fingers, I felt the old Anna stirring. The simple girl was gone, the bear in the dress was gone. The landlord was ready to see her tenants.
The morning of the meeting was as cold and sharp as a surgeon's blade. I dressed with deliberate precision, a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than a year's harvest on the Thorn farm, and a pair of simple gold earrings. I looked at my reflection. Gone was the girl with the sun-scorched neck and the perpetual smell of diesel and chicken feed. In her place was a woman who spoke in millions and thought in decades. "They're here, Miss Thorne," my assistant, Sarah, whispered through the intercom. "They've brought their daughter as their legal counsel. They seem distressed." "Let them wait," I said, leaning back in my chair. 10 minutes for every year they made me feel like an interloper in my own home. That makes it 100 minutes, Sarah. But let's be merciful. Give them 30. I watched them through the tinted glass of my office door. My father, Henry, was wearing his Sunday suit, the one that was now 2 sizes too big for his shrunken frame. My mother, Martha, looked around the sleek, marble-floored lobby with a mix of awe and resentment. And Clara was pacing. She was dressed in a cheap, flashy power suit, clutching her leather briefcase like a shield. She was trying to look like a high-powered attorney, but I could see the cracks in her mask. The firm she'd been fired from had clearly taken her dignity along with her desk. Finally, the doors opened. As they walked into the boardroom, they didn't look at me. They looked at the view, the sprawling skyline of the city that had swallowed their daughter and spat out a titan. I sat at the head of the mahogany table, my back turned to the window. "Thank you for seeing us, Mr. or Ms." my father started, his voice cracking. He peered at me, squinting against the bright morning light. "We are here to discuss the Terra Firm holdings on the Thorn acreage. There's been a misunderstanding with the bank, and we believe a restructuring is in everyone's best interest." "Take a seat, Henry," I said. My voice was low, melodic, and entirely unfamiliar to them. They sat. Clara opened her briefcase with a practiced flourish. "I am Clara Thorne, representing the interests of Thorne Agricultural. My clients are prepared to offer a 5-year repayment plan at a revised interest rate. We feel that Terra Firm's current aggressive acquisition strategy is, frankly, predatory and would not hold up well in a court of equity." She was using the big words my mother said I'd never understand. She sounded like a child playing dress-up. "Predatory?" I asked, turning my chair slowly to face them. "That's an interesting choice of words, Clara, especially coming from someone whose entire education was funded by predatory labor." The silence in the room became heavy enough to crush bone. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My father's face went through a terrifying spectrum of colors, from pale gray to a deep, bruised purple. Clara froze, her pen poised over a legal pad, her eyes widening as she finally recognized the simple girl she had mocked. "Anna," my father whispered, what kind of sick joke is this? You're working here? You're a secretary for the owner?" "I don't think you're listening, Henry," I said, leaning forward and resting my chin on my laced fingers. "I don't work for Terra Firm. I am Terra Firm. I am the landlord, I am the debt holder, and as of this morning, I am the owner of every single blade of grass on that farm you burned my books on." Clara slammed her hand on the table, trying to reclaim her crumbling authority. "This is a conflict of interest. You can't own our debt. It's unethical. I'll file a motion so fast your head will spin." "On what grounds, Clara?" I asked, sliding a thick folder across the table toward her. "The debt was purchased legally from a third-party aggregator. The mortgages were signed by our father, with you as the witnessing notary. Did you not read the fine print about assignable interest? Or were you too busy spending the investments Dad sent you?" Clara grabbed the papers, her eyes darting across the lines. Her hands began to shake. She knew she had messed up the paperwork years ago in her haste to get the money. "Anna, honey," my mother started, her voice suddenly sweet, dripping with a desperation that made my skin crawl. "We didn't know. We thought you were lost. If we knew you were doing so well, we would have celebrated. We're a family. Surely you won't turn your own parents out onto the street." "Family?" I asked. "Is that what we were? Because I remember a tractor with a name. I remember a girl who was told she was too stupid for books while she was the only one smart enough to keep the farm from drowning. You didn't lose me, Martha. You traded me. You traded me for a law degree that isn't worth the paper it's printed on." My father stood up, his face contorted with rage. "You think you're so smart because you made some money in the city? You're still just a girl who knows how to dig holes. You've got no right to treat us this way." "I have every right, Dad," I said, my voice rising just enough to command the room. "Because while you were celebrating Clara's intelligence, I was studying the land you were killing. I knew about the lithium deposits in the northwest corner 5 years before the surveyors did. I knew about the water table shifts. I invested, I learned, and I grew. You stayed small, you stayed arrogant, and now you've run out of soil." I stood up and walked to the window. "Here is the reality. The foreclosure is complete. The grace period ended at midnight. I didn't bring you here to negotiate. I brought you here to give you a choice." "A choice?" Clara spat, though her voice was trembling. "Option 1, I said, turning back to them. I execute the eviction. You leave the farm with nothing but the clothes on your backs. Clara can try to find work at a mall, and you two can find a state-run home. I sell the land to a mining conglomerate and turn our family history into a gravel pit." My mother began to sob. My father looked like he was about to collapse. "Option 2, I continued. You sign over the remaining water rights and the mineral deeds to me. In exchange, I grant you a life estate in the house. You can stay there until you pass away. But you don't own it. You don't run it. You are my tenants. And Clara," I looked at my sister, who was staring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, "Clara is banned from the property. She's an adult with a degree. She can find her own way in the world she was so prepared for." "You're a monster," Clara whispered. "No," I replied, sitting back down and sliding a pen toward my father. "I'm an agronomist, I'm an investor, and most importantly, I'm the girl who knows how to spell consequences. Sign the papers, Henry, or leave my office." My father looked at the pen. He looked at the daughter he had dismissed as a simple worker. With a shaking hand, he reached for the paper. The dirt had finally claimed its due. The drive back to the Thorne farm took exactly 4 hours, but it felt like traversing a lifetime. I didn't arrive in a dusty pickup truck this time. I sat in the back of a black executive SUV, watching the Nebraska horizon bleed into the familiar gold and brown of the plains. As the vehicle turned onto the gravel path leading to the farmhouse, the dust didn't settle on me, it rose like a salute. My parents were waiting on the porch. They looked like statues carved from grief. Henry was sitting in his old wooden rocker, but he wasn't rocking. Martha was standing by the screen door, her hands twisted in her apron. They were staying in the house by my mercy, and the weight of that charity clearly tasted like ash in their mouths. I stepped out of the car. The air smelled of dry corn and impending rain, the scent of my childhood. But the house looked smaller than I remembered, or perhaps I had simply grown too large for it. "The surveyors will be here tomorrow," I said, not bothering with a greeting. I walked up the porch steps, my heels clicking sharply against the wood where I used to scrub the mud away on my knees. "Anna," my mother whispered, her eyes searching mine for a spark of the girl she used to command. "We've moved your things into the guest room. We thought you might want to stay a while, as a family." "I'm staying in the master suite, Martha," I replied coldly. "You and Henry can move into the guest wing, and I've hired a property manager to oversee the daily operations. You are no longer responsible for the books, the crops, or the staff. You are simply residents." My father finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "You're really going to do it, aren't you? You're going to tear this place apart for the minerals beneath it. You're going to kill the farm." "I'm not killing it, Dad. I'm evolving it. You were trying to grow corn in a desert. I'm going to grow a future. But first, I have to clear the weeds." I walked into the house. It smelled of stale coffee and old furniture. I went straight to the fireplace, the spot where they had burned my dreams 10 years ago. It was empty now, swept clean, but in my mind I could still see the glowing embers of my textbooks. "Where is Clara?" I asked. She's staying at a motel in town," my mother said, following me like a ghost. "She's trying to find a job, Anna, but everyone knows about the Thorne bankruptcy. No firm will take her. She's your sister. Can't you at least give her a position in your company? As a junior clerk, maybe?" "Clara doesn't have the temperament for junior work," I said, running my finger along the mantel. "She was trained to be at the top, remember? Let her see how the view looks from the bottom for a change." The next morning, the great transformation began. A fleet of white trucks emblazoned with the Terra Firm logo arrived at dawn. Scientists in lab coats took soil samples from the northwest quadrant. Engineers mapped the water table with drones. I stood in the middle of the field holding a tablet, watching the data stream in. "Miss Thorne," the lead geologist said, walking over to me, "you were right, the lithium concentration in the subsoil is even higher than the satellite imaging suggested. But there's something else. The old irrigation system your father installed, it's been leaking nitrates into the deep water pockets for years. If you hadn't stopped the farming now, the land would have been toxic in another 24 months. I looked toward the house. My father was watching us from the barn, a silhouette of a man who thought he knew everything, while he was poisoning the very thing he claimed to love. "Start the remediation plan," I ordered, "and I want the old tool shed demolished by noon. I want nothing left of the place where I had to hide who I was." As the afternoon sun began to bake the earth, a silver sedan pulled up the driveway. It was Clara. She stepped out, looking disheveled. Her expensive suit was wrinkled, and her hair was a mess. She didn't look like a lawyer. She looked like a fugitive. She marched up to me in the field. "You can't do this, Anna. I've been reading the statutes. There's a homestead protection clause that—" "I wrote the amendment for that clause 3 years ago, Clara. I consulted for the state legislative board on land reform. You would know that if you spent more time in the law library and less time at the country club." "You think you're so much better than us," she screamed, her voice cracking in the open air. "Just because you got lucky with some investments, you're still the girl who smells like manure." I finally looked at her. I didn't feel anger. I felt a strange, cold pity. "I don't smell like manure, Clara. I smell like the owner of the ground you're standing on. And as of 5 minutes ago, I've signed the trespassing order. You have 10 minutes to say goodbye to Mom and Dad before the sheriff arrives to escort you off the Thorne property." "You wouldn't—" "Try me," I said. I watched as the realization finally hit her. The sister who had everything was now a ghost in her own home. She ran toward the house, crying out for her mother, but the terra firm security guards stepped into her path. 10 minutes, Clara. Make them count," I shouted after her. That evening, the tool shed was gone. The ground where it stood was leveled, ready for the new research facility. I sat on the porch watching the sunset, holding a glass of wine that cost more than my father's first tractor. My mother came out, sitting tentatively on the edge of the stairs. "Is it enough, Anna? The revenge? Does it make you happy to see us like this?" I took a sip of the wine, feeling the cool liquid hit the back of my throat. "It's not about revenge, Martha. It's about balance. You spent 20 years telling me I was simple. I spent 10 years proving I was a master. Now, for the rest of your lives, you get to live in the world I built. And the best part? You don't even have to understand how it works." I stood up and walked into the house, leaving her in the twilight. The simple girl was dead. The farm was a laboratory, and the dust had finally settled where it belonged.
The demolition of the tool shed uncovered more than just rotten wood and rusty nails. Beneath the concrete slab, hidden in a rusted metal box that had been buried long before I was even born, my workers found a series of geological reports dated 1995. I sat at the heavy oak desk in my father's former office, now my command center, and spread the yellowed papers out. My hands, despite the years of corporate polish, felt cold. These were surveys conducted by an oil and mineral company decades ago. They had offered my father a fortune for the mineral rights when I was just a toddler. He had turned them down, not because he wanted to preserve the sanctity of the land, but because the report explicitly stated that the mineral extraction would require a level of technical oversight that he couldn't control. He didn't want the money if it meant having men smarter than him on his property, telling him where to dig. He chose to struggle and keep his ego intact rather than thrive and admit he wasn't the master of the earth. But that wasn't the worst part. "Miss Thorne," my lead environmental engineer David said as he entered the office. He looked pale. "We've finished the deep core testing near the old well, the one your father capped off when you were 12. "And?" I asked, though I already felt the answer in my gut. "The nitrates aren't the only thing in the water, Anna. There are traces of heavy metals, lead and arsenic. Your father knew the well was tainted. Instead of paying for a filtration system or reporting it to the county, which would have led to a mandatory inspection of his traditional fertilizers, he simply threw a lid over it and forced you all to drink from a neighboring plot that was only slightly cleaner." I closed my eyes. I remembered the year my mother was constantly sick with mysterious migraines. I remembered the fatigue that haunted me as a teenager. He had gambled with our health to protect his image as a self-sufficient farmer who didn't need government interference. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. I found Henry in the barn, sitting on a bale of hay, staring at a tractor that would never run again. The roar of the terra firma excavation machinery echoed in the distance, a constant reminder that his era was over. "You knew," I said, throwing the 1995 reports at his feet. He looked down at the papers, but he didn't have to. The shame on his face was the only confirmation I needed. "We were farmers, Anna," he muttered with a stubborn, pathetic pride. "We don't sell our souls to men in suits. I wanted to leave a legacy of land, not a bank account full of blood money." "A legacy of land?" I stepped closer, the smell of old hay and diesel making me sick. "You left a legacy of poison. You buried the truth because you were afraid to be a simple man in a room of experts. You let Mom suffer. You let the soil die. And you worked me like an animal to pay for Clara's lies, all while you sat on a solution you were too proud to use." "I was the man of this house," he roared, though his legs shook. "I made the decisions. And now I'm the woman who owns the house, and my first decision as owner is this: you are restricted to the guest wing. You will not set foot in the barn, the fields, or the research zones. If you even look at a shovel, I will have the security team remove you from this county. You wanted to be the master of the dirt, Henry? Well, now you're just a guest in it." As I walked away, he shouted after me, "You're just like them. You're just a suit with a cold heart." "No, Dad," I whispered to the wind. "I'm the harvest you deserved." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. I brought in a medical team to test my mother and father for long-term heavy metal exposure. I spent millions on a state-of-the-art water purification system for the entire valley, a gift to the neighbors my father had also been quietly poisoning. But while I was fixing the land, the weeds were still trying to choke the life out of my victory. Clara hadn't left town. She was staying in a cheap motel fueled with wine and a twisted sense of entitlement. She had found a disgraced local lawyer, a man who'd lost his license twice for ambulance chasing, and they were preparing a wrongful enrichment lawsuit against me. She wasn't trying to win. She was trying to embarrass me. She wanted to drag the Thorne name through the mud one last time, hoping that the negative publicity would force Terra Firm's board, my own board, to distance themselves from me. I was sitting on the porch that night, looking at the blinking lights of the sensors in the field, when my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. "You think you've won, Anna?" Clara's voice was slurred but sharp with malice. "I'm talking to a journalist tomorrow. I'm going to tell them how you stole the farm from your elderly parents. I'm going to tell them about the illegal shell companies. By the time I'm done, you'll be the most hated woman in Nebraska." "Clara," I said, looking at the moon, "do you remember the night you found my books? The night you laughed and said I was nothing without this dirt? I was right. No, you were half right. I am nothing without the dirt, because I know the dirt. I know every secret buried in it, including the one you think I don't know." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What are you talking about?" "I've been auditing the books, Clara, not just the farm's books, these student loans you claimed to be paying off for the last 5 years. I found the accounts. You weren't paying the university. You were funneling the money into a private offshore fund. You've been stealing from your dad since the day you graduated. You didn't just spend the harvest, you embezzled it." The silence on the other end was absolute. "Go ahead," I continued, "talk to the journalist. I'll be happy to provide them with the bank statements. Let's see who the world hates more, the daughter who bought the farm or the lawyer who robbed her own father blind while he was drinking poisoned water." I hung up. I sat there for a long time, the silence of the plains wrapping around me. I had the power to destroy her. I had the power to break them all.
But as I looked at the dark, wounded earth beneath me, I realized the hardest part of being the master wasn't the acquisition, it was deciding when the digging had to stop.
The next morning, the local newspaper didn't run the headline Clara had planned. Instead of an exposé on the predatory daughter, the front page featured a detailed report on the massive environmental remediation project Terra Firm Investments was launching in the valley. I had preempted her move by donating $3 million to the local school district for a new science wing and announcing a clean water initiative for every farm within a 10-mile radius. I wasn't just a landlord anymore. I was a savior. Clara, however, was not one to learn from her defeats. She showed up at the farmhouse gate at noon, accompanied by a local cameraman from a struggling digital news site. She looked frantic, clutching a folder of papers she claimed were proof of my corruption. I didn't hide in the house. I walked out to the gate, Sarah and two of my legal advisors trailing behind me. I let the cameraman film. In fact, I wanted him to. "Anna Thorne!" Clara screamed, her voice shrill and echoing across the quiet fields. "Tell the world how you forged your father's signature. Tell them how you used insider information to bankrupt your own flesh and blood." I stood perfectly still, letting her finish her tirade. When she finally paused to catch her breath, I looked directly into the camera lens. Clara has a lot to say about legacy and family, but since she brought a camera, I think it's only fair we share some facts. Sarah, the documents, please. I handed a folder to the cameraman. Inside were the bank records I had mentioned on the phone, the clear, undeniable trail of Clara's embezzlement. For 5 years, my sister led our parents to believe she was paying off her law school tuition. In reality, she was siphoning that money into a private account. She wasn't a lawyer struggling for her first big break. She was a parasite bleeding a dying farm dry. While I was working to buy this debt to keep our parents from homelessness, Clara was planning her next vacation with stolen money. Clara's face went from a defiant red to a sickly ashen gray. She reached for the folder, but Sarah pulled it back. "This is private information," she shrieked. "You can't show that." It became public interest the moment you accused me of financial impropriety. And there's more. I've filed a formal complaint with the State Bar Association regarding your ethics. I believe grand larceny against a vulnerable senior is generally frowned upon for licensed attorneys. Oh wait, I forgot. You haven't paid your bar dues in 2 years. You aren't even a licensed attorney anymore, are you? The cameraman lowered his equipment, looking at Clara with a mixture of disgust and confusion. The story he thought he had was dead. "Get off my land, Clara," I said, leaning in so only she could hear me. "The motel is paid for until tomorrow morning. After that, you are on your own. If I see you within the county limits again, I will hand these files over to the district attorney. Don't test me. I've spent 10 years learning how to bury things, and you are far easier to bury than lead-tainted soil." She didn't say another word. She turned and ran to her car, the dust of her tires a pathetic echo of the day I had left. I turned back to the farmhouse. My mother was standing behind the screen door, having heard everything. She looked broken. Her illusions about her golden child shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She finally understood that the daughter she had pinned all her hopes on was the one who had been robbing her, while the daughter she had discarded was the one providing the roof over her head. "Anna," she whispered as I walked up the porch steps. "Don't," I said, not stopping. "I've arranged for a nurse to come by tomorrow to start the detox treatments for the heavy metals. You and Henry will follow the protocol. You will eat the food the nutritionist provides. You will live a long, healthy life in this house, Martha, but you will do it in silence." I went to my office and locked the door. For the first time in 10 years, I felt the weight of the crown I had forged. It was heavy, cold, and sharp.
A few hours later, David knocked on the door. "Miss Thorne, we found something else. During the excavation for the new filtration plant, there's an old graveyard on the edge of the property. It's not on any of the deeds. It looks like it dates back to the original homesteaders." I stood up and followed him out into the twilight. On the far eastern edge of the Thorne land, beneath an ancient, gnarled oak tree that had survived a century of droughts, were 3 simple stone markers. They were weathered and moss-covered, but as I knelt and wiped away the dirt, I saw the names. They were Thorne's, sisters. They had died in the late 1800s, all under the age of 10. "What killed them?" I asked. Hard to say without an exhumation, but given the proximity to the old spring, it was likely the water. Even then, the earth was trying to tell them something was wrong. I looked back at the farmhouse, the lights glowing in the windows like false stars. My ancestors had died for this land. My father had poisoned it for his pride. My sister had robbed it for her vanity. I stood up and looked at the gnarled oak. I wasn't just the landlord, I was the survivor. "Change the plans for the research facility. We don't build on this spot. We turn this acre into a sanctuary. I want a wall built around it, a wall of stone and iron." "For protection?" asked David. "No," I replied, looking at the dark horizon, "to make sure no one ever forgets what happens when you value the dirt more than the people living on it." As the moon rose over the Nebraska plains, I realized that the harvest was almost complete. The weeds were gone, the soil was being cleaned, the truth was out. There was only one thing left to do. I had to decide what kind of thorn I was going to be for the next 10 years.
By the 7th month of my return, the farm was unrecognizable. Massive solar arrays shimmered where the dead corn used to stand, and the state-of-the-art filtration plant hummed like a living heart in the center of the property. I had turned a graveyard of dreams into a laboratory of the future. But inside the house, a different kind of decay was festering. Henry hadn't spoken to me since I restricted his movement. He spent his days sitting by the window in the guest wing, watching the terra firm engineers with a gaze full of silent, concentrated venom. I thought he was defeated. I thought the weight of his revealed secrets had crushed his spirit. I was wrong. A man who has spent 40 years believing he is a king does not stop being a tyrant just because his crown is made of paper. One evening, Sarah entered my office, her face tight with concern. "Miss Thorne, we have a problem with the local agricultural board. Someone filed an anonymous complaint claiming that our lithium extraction is violating heritage zoning laws. They've issued a temporary cease and desist order." I looked up from my laptop, my eyes narrowing. Heritage zoning? This land hasn't been designated as a heritage site in 100 years. Who would have the old records to even file such a specific claim? "Not a who," Sarah replied, sliding a document across the desk. "A what? Someone provided them with the original handwritten land grant from 1862. It was hidden in a safe deposit box in town." I didn't need to ask who had the key to that box. I walked down the hallway to the guest wing. I didn't knock. I threw the door open to find my father sitting in his armchair, a smug, archaic smile playing on his lips. On the small table beside him was a glass of water, the clean, purified water I was providing, and an old, leather-bound ledger. "Heritage zoning, Henry? Really?" I asked, tossing the cease and desist order onto his lap. "You'd rather let this land sit idle and rot than see me succeed with it?" "It's not about the land anymore, Anna. It's about the soul of this place. You're building a factory, not a home. You're turning Thorne ground into a corporate spreadsheet. I'd rather see the state take it for a park than let you sell the dirt to the highest bidder." "The highest bidder is the only reason you have a roof over your head," I snapped. "You're using the law you never respected to fight the daughter you never loved. It's pathetic." "Is it?"
He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with a manic spark. A man who has spent 40 years believing he is a king does not stop being a tyrant just because his crown is made of paper. I walked back to my office, the adrenaline of battle replaced by a cold, calculating fury. I spent the next 48 hours with my legal team digging through every scrap of paper the Thorns had ever generated. If Henry wanted to play the heritage card, I was going to show him exactly what kind of heritage he was protecting. Friday morning arrived. The agricultural board meeting was held in the town hall, a room filled with local farmers who looked at me with a mix of suspicion and admiration. Henry sat in the front row, flanked by a few of his old, bitter friends. He looked like a patriarch defending his honor. The board chairman cleared his throat. "Miss Thorne, the claim brought before us suggests that the northwest quadrant of your property is a site of historical agricultural significance under the 1862 grant. If this is true, industrial extraction is prohibited." I stood up, my heels echoing against the wooden floorboards. I didn't look at the board. I looked at my father. "My father is correct about one thing," I began, my voice steady and clear. "This land has a heritage, but he's been very selective about which part of that heritage he wants to preserve. He presented you with the 1862 grant, but he neglected to show you the 1924 environmental easement." I signaled Sarah, who began handing out copies of a document I had found hidden in the archives of the county recorder's office, a document my grandfather had signed. In 1924, my grandfather realized the soil was being depleted. He signed a perpetual easement that mandated the land be used for progressive agricultural advancement. It was a clause meant to ensure the Thorne family never stayed stagnant. By building a research facility that focuses on soil remediation and green energy, I am the only Thorne in 3 generations actually following the legal heritage of this land. I turned back to the board. "But there's more. The heritage my father is protecting includes 30 years of illegal chemical dumping and the intentional concealment of a poisoned well. If you uphold this zoning based on his claim, you are officially designating a toxic waste site as a historical landmark. Is that the precedent this board wants to set?" The room went silent. The farmers in the audience began to murmur, their faces turning from suspicion to shock. My father's face drained of color. He tried to stand, but his legs gave way, and he slumped back into his chair. "The claim is dismissed," the chairman said, banging his gavel. "The cease and desist is lifted. Miss Thorne, continue your work." I walked out of the town hall without looking back. I felt no joy in the victory, only a profound exhaustion. When I returned to the farmhouse, I found my mother waiting for me on the porch. She looked at me not with the condescension of the past, but with a terrifying kind of awe. "Henry is packing his things, Anna," she said. "He says he can't live under your tyranny anymore. He's going to go stay with Clara at that motel." "Then let him go," I said, stepping past her. "The limousine is in the driveway. If he wants to leave the house I'm paying for, to stay in a room that smells of cheap cigarettes with the daughter who robbed him, that's his choice. But tell him this, once he crosses that gate, the life estate is over. He never comes back." I went to my room and sat in the dark. A few minutes later, I heard the crunch of gravel as the car drove away. The house was finally quiet. The last of the old guard was gone. But as I sat there, I realized that I was now truly alone in the empire of dirt. I had won the land, I had won the law, and I had won the future. But as I looked at my hands in the moonlight, I realized they were still stained, not with mud, but with the cold, hard reality of what it takes to survive a family like mine. The phone on my desk buzzed. It was a representative from the Global Energy Summit. They wanted me to be the keynote speaker in London. They wanted to know about the Thorne method. I picked up the phone. "This is Anna Thorne," I said, my voice as hard as the minerals beneath my feet.
10 years had passed since I first walked away from the Thorn farm with nothing but a hidden laptop and a heart full of cold fire. Now I stood on a stage in London, the glass ceiling of the summit hall reflecting the sharp, sophisticated woman I had become. They introduced me as the woman who healed the earth. The simple girl of the soil was now a global icon of the Green Revolution. In my speech, I didn't talk about lithium or profits. I talked about truth. I told the audience that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a drought or a toxic well, it's the arrogance of a man who refuses to learn. I spoke about how dirt only becomes a prison if you choose to stop digging for knowledge. When I finished, the applause was a thunderous roar, but all I could hear was the quiet memory of the wind through the Nebraska corn. After the summit, I didn't go to a gala. I went to a small, private office I maintained in the city. Sarah was waiting for me with a final set of folders. "The motel in Nebraska was foreclosed on last month," Sarah said softly. "Clara and your father moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment in the city. The rent is being paid anonymously through one of our legacy shells, just as you ordered." "And Clara?" I asked, looking out at the London rain. "She's working as a receptionist for a mid-tier insurance company. She goes by C.L. Thorne. No one knows she ever had a law degree. And your father, he mostly sits on the balcony and stares at the traffic. He doesn't speak much." I looked at the photos Sarah had provided. Henry looked like a shell of a man, his eyes hollowed out by the city's noise. Clara looked tired, her once manicured hands now calloused from typing. I felt no surge of joy. I felt no rush of triumph. I simply felt finished. "Stop the reports, Sarah," I said. "I don't need to know any more. The balance has been struck. They are living a life of their own making, and I am living mine." I returned to Nebraska one last time before the official opening of the Thorne Global Research Center. The farm was no longer a farm. It was a cathedral of glass, steel, and living greenery. The air was sweet and clean, the water from the deep wells purer than anything that had flowed there in a century. I walked to the eastern edge of the property, to the sanctuary I had built around the ancient oak tree and the 3 small stone markers. I knelt by the graves of the sisters who had died so long ago. I placed 3 small polished stones on their markers. "I fixed the water," I whispered to the earth. "No one else has to die for this dirt." As I stood up, I saw a figure standing near the entrance of the sanctuary. It was my mother, Martha. She hadn't left with Henry. She had chosen to stay in the guest wing, living in the silence of the house I owned. She looked older, her face a map of the choices she had made, and the ones she hadn't. "You're leaving for good this time, aren't you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The center is self-sustaining now, Martha," I said. "I have offices in Zurich and Singapore. My work is global. I've done what I came here to do." "You did more than that, Anna," she said, looking at the gleaming research facility. "You showed us what we were. You were the mirror we were too afraid to look into." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, charred object. It was the corner of a book cover, black and brittle. It was from the textbook my father had thrown into the fire 10 years ago. "I saved this," she said, her voice breaking. "I pulled it out after you left that night. I didn't have the courage to give it to you then. I didn't have the courage to tell Henry he was wrong. I thought if I stayed quiet, I could keep the peace." "Peace without truth is just a slow-motion war, Martha," I said, taking the charred fragment. It felt like a relic from a different life. "But I don't need this anymore. I have the whole library now." I turned away from her and walked toward the black SUV waiting for me at the gate. I didn't look back at the farmhouse. I didn't look back at the woman who let me be treated like a tractor. As the car pulled onto the main road, the sun began to set over the plains.
The golden hour turned the solar panels into a sea of fire, and for a moment the whole valley looked like it was made of light. I opened my laptop and began to draft a new proposal. It was for a project in sub-Saharan Africa, reclaiming desert land for a new generation of female farmers. I would provide the tech, the seeds, and most importantly, the education. I would make sure that no girl ever had to hide her books in a tool shed again. My name is Anna Thorne. They called me simple. They called me uneducated. They tried to bury me in the dirt, but they forgot that I was the one who knew how to make things grow. The harvest was over, and the future was finally mine to plant.